Let's Talk Lungs with Jill from Lung Saskatchewan. Dedicated to connecting you with lung health experts and key opinion leaders that will help you transform your care and practice with current, evidence-based lung health information. This podcast is recorded on Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, as well as the territory of the Métis.
Today's Let's Talk Lungs episode is powered by GSK, a science-led global healthcare company with a special purpose: to unite science, technology, and talent to get ahead of disease together. With GSK's support, we are able to connect you with lung experts to better empower you to learn how to take your best breath with every lung talk, wherever you are. Thank you, GSK. As we breathe in, we are inspired today by lung expert Dr. Samir Gupta. Dr. Gupta is a lung specialist, clinician scientist, and associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Chances are you've seen him on TV or online with his popular YouTube channel, The Feed with Dr. G. Today, how's your lung life? Tips on how to protect and love your lungs. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for being on the show. Happy Valentine's Day to you.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks for having me, and happy Valentine's Day to you and to all the listeners out there.
All right. Well, we hope to inspire our listeners not just to think about their love life, but also their lung life. And we want to talk to you about tips on how we can protect and love our lungs. So let's get inspired. First, I want to ask you why you love lung health and what made you choose to go on and specialize specifically as a respirologist, scientist, and researcher.
Well, that's a great question. We get that question a lot from family and friends, sometimes from patients. There's so many specialties in medicine, and they're so different one from the other. And so what makes you choose one thing over another? I think for a lot of us, it's just the mentors you encounter in your medical education journey. As a med student, I met a mentor who thought I'd be a good internist and took me under his wing and said, you should really do this. And then I did internal medicine, and something similar happened in internal medicine. We all do a respiratory block, and the folks on the block kind of did the same thing. They took me under their wing and said, hey, do some research with me, learn about this field. I think you'd be good at it. And then you sort of start picturing yourself in it. And there's a couple of things about respirology that are quite nice. It's very diverse. So, you get to use your knowledge of medicine, and you don't lose your knowledge of medicine because we see everything. We see infections in the lung, inflammation in the lung. We deal with lung cancer. We can't forget about the other organs because they all affect us. If your heart's not working, the fluid backs up into your lungs. And so the lungs are kind of at the center of everything. So you really keep your knowledge, and you have to know most of what you learned in your training. And then what's also neat about it is that we get to apply what we call physiology. So that's kind of where physics and math meets biology. And there's a lot of that in lung medicine, in respiratory medicine. So a lot of us are kind of, physics and math nerds, and we kind of bring that passion for that into medicine through the field of respirology. So I think those are some of the things, and I bet you a lot of the other respirologists that you might talk to would tell you something similar.
That's wonderful. And physics and math nerds, we love them, and thank goodness we have them. And thank you for the work that you do. And you're absolutely right. Our lungs are the center of so much of us, and we think, oh, they're a specialist in lung health, but really, you're an overall specialist in wellness. We can't just divide ourselves up into individual parts. So that's wonderful. And I know you help so many people, and we're just so excited to have you on the show. I follow your research and your work, and I have for many years. And I have to admit, I'm a really big fan. I'm a little bit starstruck today talking with you. In addition to being a clinician and researcher, you are a regular medical correspondent appearing on multiple networks and shows, communicating about health and science, which is so cool. You are saying, you're maybe you think of yourself as a little bit of a math and science nerd, but you make science cool, my friend. And you have a very popular YouTube channel called The Feed with Dr. G. And your mission specifically is to make science fun and so easy to understand that science becomes obvious. So I have to ask, why was this important for you to make science accessible and also very engaging in our world today, which is typically online?
I think that, so yes, it's a passion for me, but I also think that as we move forward, this is going to be a core, almost requirement, if not just skill, for all physicians. We have a role with patients, but we have this role with the public. And I think that this public health education piece, as it's becoming more and more important as we move to an online world for information access, and including health information access, this becomes a core competency of any physician, I think. And some will do it, will spend more time doing it than others, but I think all of us should spend some time doing it. As you know, Jill, I used to do a lot of television. I still do television, but I started my sort of public health education part of my career, science communication part of my career, with conventional media like television and radio. For me, it was, I think the transition really happened during the pandemic, which is when we saw also a transition in what we were seeing in terms of this infodemic, all this information, including misinformation and disinformation, particularly about the virus, about the COVID-19 disease, the virus that causes the disease, and about the vaccines that we have for COVID-19 disease. And so there was a transition there where I realized that for millennials and Gen Zs in particular, it's not just a complementary source of information, it's the only source of information. And the challenge with that is that your conventional sources like television, there are checks and balances there. You need certain qualifications. You need to be vetted to be on that medium. But that is not the story with online. With online, anybody who has a nice webcam and a decent video editing software, which is just about anyone because that's accessible and inexpensive, can produce what can be a very polished looking video and put that out. And if they're good at it, it can be very engaging. It might be comical. They can put all the ingredients in there that will make it viral, that will make it sticky. And it can have all the wrong information. It can be completely wrong. It could be intentionally wrong. It could be misleading intentionally. And yet it will reach many people, and that's all they're going to see. And so that was, I think, for me, where this became really important, is that we need to be there too. Science needs to be there. The evidence-based information needs to be there. And we have to understand that we're competing for attention spans, which are short. We're competing for eyeballs. Our content has to be viral too. We have to have engaging content, attractive content. It has to be, you have to jump on trends. It has to be funny when it needs to be. So all of that, production value needs to go in there, because that's in fact where many people are getting their information, and the only place for some people that they're getting their information. And if we're not there, then there's a risk that much of what they get is incorrect. And then ultimately that translates to bad healthcare decisions that they make for themselves, and ultimately harm. And people will suffer more from illness as a result of that. And so for me, it really was, I think, what we learned in the pandemic in terms of the importance of online health information that kind of pushed me to put more of my public health education time towards the online aspect of that education.
I commend you so much for being so forward-thinking and recognizing where there was a gap. And also, I just think it's so cool how you took time to think about what some of the marketing tactics and appeal are to people that we often see in other industries. And that's really not something that we typically see in health. So I commend you to that, because I often think of some of the tactics that are used in other industries of, what they use to get our attention, what they use to make the product appealing so we purchase it, what they say to make us think it is true, whether it is harmful or healthy. And I always think about the tobacco industry and and really that's when that really became apparent that, they used role models, they used flashy advertising. But after decades of science and media, and unfortunately we saw a lot of illness and death, we know now that smoking is one of the most harmful things we can do for our health and our lungs in particular. But I want to ask you a little bit, what does the science say in regards to vaping, and are we falling into a little bit of that trap with vaping?
That's the fear. And I would say that the science is evolving. It's early days. We're still learning. Like you said, it was decades and decades of science around tobacco smoking and its impacts on health. The vaping story is complicated because there really are two sides to it. There's the harm reduction side, and there's a side that says, look, this is probably less harmful than smoking. And so could this be, for people who can't quit smoking through other mechanisms that we have, could this be a second best that they convert from smoking cigarettes to vaping? There's a question mark around that because it hasn't been long enough for us to know if it is actually less harmful than cigarettes. But I think by and large, most people would say that if I had to guess, based on what we know about vaping versus smoking, it probably is less harmful. So there's an argument there for harm reduction. There's also an argument that's being strengthened by science recently around its impact for smoking cessation. And so, look, we have more and more studies that suggest it's probably at least as effective as nicotine replacement, maybe as effective as some of the medications we use, maybe more effective. Most of those studies, and this is an asterisk, will show that you can effectively quit, some proportion of the population can effectively quit smoking and use vapes to get there, but we don't know if they then quit the vaping. So you may be then swapping one addiction for another. But again, that comes back to the harm reduction argument where it's probably better to have this addiction than the smoking addiction. So that's one side of the coin. And when you look at it from that perspective, need more science, need more research, absolutely. But attractive option for me to, let's say, prescribe to my patient. Yeah, you're smoking. Here's an option for you to help you to quit smoking, for sure. But the other side of this coin is that most of the people who vape are not, in fact, smokers who are using it for smoking cessation or harm reduction. They are people who never smoked, who are, in fact, being introduced to a new habit and perhaps a new addiction. And really there is what we were worried about our young people. We have studies, and now about has improved a little bit in the last few surveys in Canada, but we still have a very high rate of vaping in our young people, in adolescents. And we worry about it there. We used to worry about it as what we call a gateway drug, where people get hooked on nicotine e-cigarettes and it's their introduction to nicotine and they graduate to cigarettes. It doesn't seem like that's panning out based on what we're seeing in the research. But instead of that, what we're seeing is that many people will stay hooked on the vapes. So you are introducing at a young age an addiction. And make no mistake about it, it is very addictive. Nicotine, whether you get it in a cigarette or through a vape, is very addictive, and vapes are a very effective delivery mechanism for that nicotine. You get very high spikes of nicotine level, and that releases dopamine in the brain, very much like what you see with conventional cigarettes. And so you have young people who become addicted. And are you then going to see a lifetime or decades of vape usage? And the big question there is, what is that going to do long term? That remains the question. And, historically, think back to, Big Tobacco, which owns a lot of the vape companies now. When we had Big Tobacco introducing cigarettes, it was all about, chewing tobacco is so dangerous. People get tongue cancer and mouth cancer. Here's this new way of delivering it that's not going to do that. And that that's where we are now with vapes, right? Oh, here's this new thing. It's less harmful. That's what we don't know. And what did we learn about cigarettes 10, 20, 30 years later? Well, now we know. So that's the question. What will we learn when we have a generation of folks who have vaped for 20 years? What are those chronic long-term effects? We don't know yet. Not enough time has gone by. We can start extrapolating that this won't be a good thing because we know that there are short-term effects. There are many, many studies, Jill, of short-term effects. We know that when you vape, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up. We know that there's an acute inflammation that happens in the lungs. There are lots of things that happen short-term. How do those translate to long-term? TBD. But sort of those are the two sides to this argument. May be helpful for my patient who has lung disease, who's desperately trying to quit and has failed other ways of quitting. Tool in my toolkit for that patient, but really worried about introducing something new to folks who would never have touched anything related to nicotine, and now they're addicted and they're doing this for potentially long-term, and what are those long-term impacts for these young people doing it?
Okay, so lots to unpack there. Potentially a helpful tool if someone is addicted to tobacco smoking, cigarettes, for example. Not so great if someone isn't smoking, but then they start vaping, because we don't know those long-term effects. And especially if it's a youth, I always think healthy youth typically lead to healthy adults. And what will that future look like? I always wonder if researchers and scientists like yourself have a crystal ball, but you don't just yet. Maybe that'll come in time. So something for us to be mindful with. You talked about some of the short-term effects that you know of right now. Can you shed a little bit more light on that? When you talked about some of the inflammatory effects, could it potentially be a trigger for someone, for example, living with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or asthma?
There are some studies that are starting to suggest that, Jill. And if you look at what's in there, I mean, if you look at the ingredients of the vape juice seem pretty innocuous. But what happens is you're using what's called an atomizer and you're superheating it. That's how you're forming that vapor. And when you're superheating those contents, you are creating new chemicals in the process. And so when you think about some of the things that have been found in that vapor, we're talking about metals like nickel and lead. We're talking about known carcinogens, formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, herbicide, acrolein is an example of a herbicide that's been found in there. So there are just so many chemicals in there that it stands to reason that you're going to have short-term inflammatory effects. You're potentially going to have those long-term effects. Again, waiting for that information. But certainly if you have these kinds of inflammatory substances in that vapor, and you have airways that are sensitive to inflammation, and that's your example of patients with asthma and COPD, they already have airways that are not normal, that are damaged in some way, and that are sensitive. You are going to predispose those patients both to more acute symptoms, and some patients do have that, but also the concern is, what does it do to the evolution of their condition? If you are somebody who has COPD and you have COPD because you smoked cigarettes as part of your harm reduction, now you switch to vape. Again, this question, is it completely innocuous? No, because very likely long-term exposure to these inflammatory substances in the vapor will be harmful for you, particularly as somebody who suffers from COPD and already has damage there. And it's a similar story with asthma, where it's even more around the triggering of those events, of those we call bronchospasm, when the airways close up, all of these things that you're breathing in, does it trigger that for you and cause acute, sudden symptoms, and then long-term inflammation and long-term poor asthma control? All of those are concerns, and we're still learning about that. And to your point, it's this crystal ball thing. Really important for us in science to acknowledge when we don't know things, and be willing and ready to be proven wrong. And that's why we do the science, so we can take our assumptions and say, well, now we actually have data. And how did we do? Maybe our assumptions were incorrect. And those studies are happening, but a lot of this stands to reason. When we understand what's in that vapor, we understand the short-term effects, it stands to reason that there will be some long-term effects from that.
Yeah, there's a lot packed in that little vape. It's good for us to be aware of that. I think it's really important for people living with lung disease to understand how that vape could be impacting their breathing. And I would say likely even if they're exposed to secondhand vape, if someone around them is vaping, how that may trigger a negative response as well. Let's take a short breather and we'll be right back after this announcement.
Lung Saskatchewan has free downloadable resources and great lung health information on their website. They're also proud to bring you the Lung Life webinar series, live and on demand. Learn from more experts on a variety of lung health related topics to help you live your best lung life. Find out more at lungsask.ca.
All right, so we've talked about vaping. I want to shift a little bit away from that, and because we've talked about how vaping is often used as a way to help us quit tobacco smoke. And when we say the word smoke, people think tobacco smoke often. But in a world where we are experiencing more and more wildfires, certainly the case in Canada, and smoke from those fires, how does that type of smoke affect our health?
In so many ways, Jill, and it's a really important thing to bring up, particularly because of what happened a couple of summers ago, but because of what keeps happening and what will unfortunately keep happening and happening more and more. All of us are affected by this, particularly, of course, people who suffer from lung disease, but all of us are affected by wildfire smoke. And again, it's something that we're learning more and more about. It used to be a rare occasional exposure, but what's happening now is it's becoming a seasonal exposure for people in many parts of the world, including Canada, where you can start thinking, well, it's not just the acute wildfire exposure, but it's over 5-10 years of having exposure once, twice, 3-4 times a season for a few days at a time. It becomes a chronic intermittent type exposure, and now you can start thinking about chronic effects. So again, just like the vaping story, we know more about acute effects. The acute effects are all related to the actual, as you say, smoke, the pollutants in that smoke. And the focus in terms of research is what we call PM 2.5. PM stands for particulate matter, and 2.5 is the size. So 2.5 microns or smaller, 2.5 thousandths of a millimeter, really small particles. These are the particles that we study a lot in terms of the effects of pollution on human health. But we also know that there's a lot of PM 2.5 that gets released from wildfires, in addition to other things, to be fair, in addition to ground level ozone and carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide, and the list goes on, organic and inorganic volatile compounds. But the PM 2.5 is likely a major source of harm, human health harm. These are particles that are small enough that they kind of escape the defenses that we have in our airways, in our lungs, and they get all the way down to those tiny sacs, the alveoli in the lungs. And there are even smaller particles in that PM 2.5 that are called nanoparticles, and they get right into the bloodstream. So obviously there are effects on our lungs. Remember, the lungs are the great filter. So the lungs are filtering 10,000 liters of air a day. So if you're breathing in all this stuff, it's getting stuck in the lungs, and it's getting also through the lungs into the bloodstream. But once you're in the bloodstream, every single organ can be affected by this. So when you look at short-term effects, yes, we see flare-ups of asthma, flare-ups of COPD, and people who have those conditions who might be listening know, because they have more symptoms on those days. But we also see more heart attacks when we have wildfires. We see more strokes, we see more heart failure. It has effects on immunity. So we have this barrier immunity in our lungs. Our airways have cells along the airways that protect us just as an initial line of defense against pathogens that we might breathe in. And that smoke, that wildfire smoke, seems to impair that immunity. And we know that in lab studies, but we also know that clinically, because during the COVID pandemic, we saw more COVID cases around wildfire times. We saw more hospitalizations. We saw more COVID deaths around wildfire times. And this likely has to do with the impact of that wildfire on our lung immunity. And then, so there's just so many different ways in which this is impacting us in the short term. And then if you think about long term, we're starting to learn, and what we learn is really scary. And there were recent studies that suggest that repeated wildfire exposure significantly increases the chance of developing dementia, for example. Now, again, we're talking about getting into the bloodstream. Where does most of the blood get pumped to? Well, it's the brain. And the brain is having an impact from these particles that are getting through the lungs into the bloodstream. So many impacts, Joe, that go beyond the lungs. And if we start thinking about what we know about long-term pollution impact on health, including lung health, and we start maybe extrapolating that repeated wildfire exposure might have similar health impacts, well, it becomes even scarier. We know that people who live in more polluted environments have a lower lifespan, period. They see more cancers, they see more cardiovascular disease, more lung disease, more infections like tuberculosis. There are so many different things, and it looks like the more research we do, that it's going to have similar impacts to just being in a more polluted environment when you have these repeated high PM 2.5 exposures from these wildfires.
Wow, it's quite shocking when you talk about the ripple effect that it has. I think most of us can appreciate and understand that wildfire smoke will make conditions such as asthma, COPD more challenging to manage. We may need more medication, that sort of thing during those days. But it's quite shocking to learn that it also has an effect on all of our immune system, putting all of us at risk, and that it can get right into our blood stream and affect our entire body. So
Yeah.
it affects all of us.
Yeah. Every single one of us.
Yeah, every single one of us. So we talked a little bit about how that wildfire smoke impacts specifically people living with lung disease. Can you talk a little bit about the impact climate change has specifically on those living with a lung condition and what you've seen and what the science has shown so far?
This is an example of wildfires, or an example of the impact of climate change on health, and particularly on lung health. Why are we seeing more wildfires? Because we have warmer and drier temperatures and longer summer seasons. We have less precipitation. The wood is drier. Pine beetles have moved further north. They're killing more wood. There's more dead wood, which is fodder for those fires. There's a convergence of factors. And so this is, probably the number one thing, particularly for people with lung disease, where climate change is affecting their lung health. More wildfires, more poor air quality days, more symptoms, more flare-ups. But there are other things. I think about my patients with asthma who have allergies. Their asthma is driven by allergens like pollen. We have what's called tropicalization of further and further northern latitudes, which means that plants that couldn't grow in our climate now can grow. So we're seeing pollens that we didn't used to see. It means that we have longer pollen seasons. And this is bad for patients whose asthma is driven. Allergies and asthma is driven by those pollens. So that's one of the impacts we're seeing. We're also just seeing, all of us are sort of exposed to this volatility. Climate change is yes, it's about heat. And definitely we have more high heat days, and high heat days make the elderly and the very young susceptible, but also people with lung disease. But the volatility, people with asthma and COPD will tell you that they tend to have more symptoms and sometimes will have flare-ups when there is rapid change in temperature, rapid change in barometric pressure, humidity. They're very sensitive to these things. And what we're seeing with climate change is that these factors change very quickly. We have unpredictable weather. And so that's another impact, particularly on our airways disease patients, where climate change is driving symptoms and driving flare-ups.
Okay, so even though we've come so far and there's more and more medication available and better treatments for people living with lung disease, we may, in fact, because of our climate, be seeing more severe disease and more difficult to treat. So that's really interesting. And I commend you for some of the work that you're doing. You're really trying to make an impact on our environment and make for a healthier future. I know you're doing some research on the types of inhalers and how they impact the environment, what kind of footprint they leave, and really empowering patients and healthcare providers to know what inhaler is best for them to manage their lung disease, make sure it's easy for them to take, but also what impact does that inhaler have on the environment, and is there a better choice for the environment? So thank you for that, because I don't think many of us think about when we take our inhalers, if we have lung disease, what that potentially could be doing to our environment. So thank you for that work. I'm looking forward to seeing more of that being published in the future. So thank you. And not just talk the talk, but you walk the walk. So thank you for that. Okay, so earlier in the show, you mentioned how important it was for you to come out and do the feed with Dr. G, be really present in the online world in an entertaining, engaging way, largely because you were seeing a lot of misinformation out there in the height of the pandemic. You talked about how you were concerned that people were making health decisions, not based on the science, but just the information that was available to them. And I've heard you say a few times now that science has a communication problem. And that really became apparent during the pandemic and the height of the pandemic. So can you talk a little bit about how some of that misinformation, especially around vaccines, can be really harmful?
I think the best example of that is still the COVID-19 vaccine. And I think there was really just a galvanizing and an organization of the anti-vax movement that happened during the pandemic and around that vaccine. And there are many, many studies that show how many people could have been saved who weren't because they chose not to get this vaccine, largely because they were convinced by misinformation and disinformation, much of which was accessed online, and all the lives that could have been saved. There are interesting studies that compare in the U.S. red states versus blue states, and depending on the voting pattern, it correlated with COVID mortality, even after adjusting for other factors like age, and it sort of thought-provoking types of analyses that suggest that people who lean one end or the other on the spectrum, the political spectrum, also predicts their vaccine acceptance, which in turn predicts how likely they are to get the disease and die from the disease. So we learned so much about how information can sway. But I would say that outside of COVID, there was what we consider a halo effect. There was sort of a chill on all vaccines. It went beyond, hey, I don't trust the COVID vaccine because this is pretty new and this is mRNA, and some kind of pretty reasonable questions to ask, I think, and say, hey, let's have this conversation. But then it sort of became all vaccines. And what was a little bit more fringe previously was just, I'm not getting my childhood vaccines. That became more accepted and more common. And I think that halo effect has been really harmful. And what we've seen coming out of the pandemic, and it's been in the news a lot, is sort of this resurgence of what we call these ancient diseases that we were mostly eradicated, particularly in our part of the world, that are making a comeback. And I won't say it's all to blame on vaccine hesitancy and skepticism. There's also just disruption of health systems and access to healthcare that happened through the pandemic. So a lot of people didn't get their childhood vaccines because they couldn't get in with their doctor. It had nothing to do with vaccine skepticism. But a lot of people also stopped thinking it was as important. I wouldn't call them anti-vax, but people who were sort of on the fence and went along with it and got it done, but now didn't have as much access to their provider and didn't go out and look for it, didn't make the effort to get those vaccines. And the result of that is that a much larger proportion of the population in Europe, in North America, didn't go out and get their childhood vaccines. And what we've seen now as we come out of this is a resurgence of things like measles, outbreaks of measles, mumps, things like polio, things that we never thought we would see in this part of the world. Pertussis. Pertussis has been more of a grumbling one that's sort of been grumbling along, and yes, we're seeing more. But for some time, we've been seeing quite a bit of pertussis. But all of these are examples of, these are deadly illnesses. And I would say people forget, but for most of these people around now were not alive when these were a problem, so there's just this lack of kind of public memory of how problematic these are. And so there's this willingness, either because you're convinced by the anti-vax movement or because you just don't see it as a problem anymore, to not sort of go out and get those vaccines. And the result of that is that we get beyond a low threshold of herd immunity. And once we break through that low threshold and we don't have that herd immunity, all of a sudden we start seeing outbreaks. And who suffers the most? It's the vulnerable in society. So a lot of what we're doing with trying to get to herd immunity is saying, yeah, for most people, these are not going to be severe illnesses. For some, they will be. But particularly for the vulnerable in society who, vaccines don't work for them because they have weak immune systems, or they have certain chronic illnesses, or they've received transplants. We all do our part by getting vaccinated to protect the most vulnerable. And that's sort of gone, and we've lost that. And so, yeah, that's the harm. The harm is that all of these things are coming back and people are getting sick from them. And it's really scary because I'm having to read about polio, something that I never thought I'd have to know how to diagnose or recognize the symptoms of or even think about treating. But here we are, Jill.
It's interesting that you bring up, you're starting to have to hear and read about polio. I remember not too long ago, my parents were impacted by that. And they would say to me, you're so lucky to be in a generation that doesn't have to worry about that. And it's so sad to see and hear that that's not the case anymore. And I think there is that misconception that, hey, we don't have to worry about these anymore, but not understanding that our actions impact whether or not we have to worry about that in the future. Okay, so we've talked a lot today about what can harm our lungs and what can keep us from breathing and feeling well. I'd really like to flip the switch now and talk about how we can love our lungs. It is Valentine's Day, so what are your top lung tips to love and protect your lungs?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I think about the lungs, the way that we interact with our lungs is by choosing what we breathe in. That's how we treat our lungs, is by choosing the air that our lungs get exposed to. And so, in continuing the theme of what we've talked about today, don't breathe in toxic things. That's how you're going to love your lungs. And don't breathe in infectious pathogens. That's how you're going to love your lungs. And then also protect your lungs through things like vaccines. And so, it seems pretty obvious. Don't breathe in the burning tobacco leaf or marijuana leaf or all those chemicals we talked about in that vapor from e-cigarettes. But that extends to pollution, right? Don't breathe in pollution. And that's, of course, easier said than done. But generally, we're lucky. We're in a part of the world where the air is very clean, except at those times when we're in the middle of a wildfire. And wildfire smoke moves far and wide. You don't have to be in the province where the wildfires are to suffer from the air pollution effects of that wildfire. So it means knowing your AQHI, wearing a mask if you have to go outside, a KN95 or an N95 mask. You can still protect yourself. Not exercising outside, because we breathe more when we exercise outside, so not exercising outside on a poorer quality day. Running your HVAC continuously, changing your filters at home, using a HEPA filter, keeping your windows closed when there's pollution outside. There's a lot we can do to mitigate air pollution exposure. So it's keeping those toxins out of your lungs. The other thing is, as I mentioned with infectious pathogens, I think we've all figured out how to put a mask on, and we can all manage to put a mask on, having been through the pandemic. And I hope it's been normalized for a lot of us. I wear a mask in respiratory viral season on the subway when it's crowded. That's a simple, easy thing to do. Protects me, protects others in case I have pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic infection. It's something that's been done in other parts of the world for long before the pandemic. It seems like a very courteous thing to do. Protect yourself and others around you. And so wear a mask where you're in a high-risk situation to protect yourself against those infectious pathogens. And the last piece is boost your immunity against those infectious pathogens. And like you said, we're in this era. We're very lucky to be in an era where we have great vaccines for terrible illnesses. We have a flu vaccine. We have a COVID vaccine. We have an RSV vaccine, and that's pretty new. And thank goodness we have it, because
Very
in terms
exciting.
of respiratory viral morbidity, harm, RSV is number 3 after flu and COVID. And it's a big one. And a lot of people haven't heard of it, but it's important. And it's really meaningful that we have a vaccine for it now. And we also, of course, have the pneumonia vaccine for that bacterial infection that affects us as well. The pneumonia, bacteria that causes pneumonia. And so the point is, avail yourself of those things, for the things that you're eligible for that protection. Go out and get it. And that's how you're going to love your lungs.
Okay, so our lungs are meant to breathe in fresh, clean air. We all have lungs. We all need to breathe. So it's up to all of us to take care of our lungs. And yes, science has made it so we have these opportunities and things that we can do to further protect ourselves and others, such as the vaccines. I've really, really enjoyed our chat today. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you one more question. And I want to know a final thought here. What expert advice do you hope listeners take away from our conversation today? Because we did talk about a lot.
We talked about a ton. I think just broadly, it's all about education today. This was probably information overload. We talked about a lot of different things. People will keep getting information from many other sources. And I think one of the most important things is make sure you get your information from many sources. Just be aware of the risks that are out there. People are starting to get an understanding of algorithms on social media that validate a certain viewpoint, take you down a rabbit hole. Actively go out and seek out opposing viewpoints. Recognize that there are dangers in getting your information from one source. Look for some type of credibility, validity in the information source you're getting. If they're trying to sell you something at the same time, it's probably not a good source. If there's a university or a well-known hospital behind it, it's probably a much better source. But ultimately, it's all about curating that information. And before you make any healthcare decisions, ideally engage your provider. That's what we're here for. We're here, and tell us what you've read. I want to hear it. I want to know what you've read so that I can formulate a really convincing argument for why it might be wrong or aspects of it might be right. Where there is uncertainty, and we'll acknowledge that. Hey, you know what you're saying, I get it. We actually don't know that. We don't know that piece, but here's what we know from the past and where we're extrapolating and why we think that's pretty reasonable to do. So, I think the main message is just be careful where you get your information and engage your healthcare provider before you make those healthcare decisions for yourself.
Okay, so don't just pay attention to the headlines or the sound bites. Look at the source. Look at multiple sources. Try and find credible sources. And when in doubt, speak to your healthcare provider if you have questions so you can make an informed decision about your health.
That's a great summary, Jill.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta, for being here today and on the show. And thank you for doing what you do, empowering people through the science and research that you do. And if people haven't already done so, I highly encourage you to check out The Feed with Dr. G. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day, and thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks to all of you out there listening, and love your lungs.
In summary, on today's Let's Talk About Lungs show, Dr. Gupta inspired us to think more about our lung life, using science to know how to protect our lungs. His work has shown that science is the key to understanding and maximizing our health and wellness. His top lung health tips today were: breathe in fresh air, love your lungs by staying up to date with your vaccines, wear a mask in crowded places, and make sure to get your information from credible sources so you can make an informed decision about your health. If you have a question for a lung expert, we want to hear from you. Send it in, tell us what you want to know, and we'll get it on the upcoming shows. Send it to info@lungsask.ca.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support LungSask's Let's Talk Lungs podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Follow LungSask on Instagram @LungSask and on X @LungSask. That's all for this episode. See you next time. Produced at Sound Lounge by T-Bone.